Welcome back to Giant Monster Games. I'm Ted, and this week we're going to take a look at a deck I like to call Hunted Orb. But before we get into it, remember to like, comment, and subscribe to Giant Monster Games if you enjoy this content, and remember to vote for the next video. So let's get into it. This deck revolves around two cards which we use to cheat on Enter the Battlefield abilities. We're running 4 copies of Torpor Orb and 4 copies of Sundial the Infinite. When you hear about cheating on Enter the Battlefield abilities, you may think to cards like Panharmonicon that allow us to double those abilities. But the direction of this deck is a bit different in that we're using these cards to eliminate Enter the Battlefield abilities altogether. We're using Torpor Orb to do just that, turning off Enter the Battlefield abilities on all creatures. This gives us a ton of value and really hurts our opponents who are relying on their creatures entering the battlefield abilities. So it turns off cards like Snapcaster Mage and Reclamation Sage. Sundial the Infinite isn't as good as Torpor Orb per se, but when we cast a creature, we can use Torpor Orb's ability to respond to the creature's ability, ending the turn, removing the creature's ability from the stack. But to keep it completely simple, that just means that when we cast a creature, that creature's ability goes on the stack, we just tap Sundial, we pay 1, and we pass the turn. All abilities on the stack get exiled. Now, Sundial can also be used to respond to different kinds of removal or other spells our opponent would really want to cast on our turn to get the most advantage out of it. So, if our opponent, for example, casts a Lightning Bolt on one of our creatures, we can tap Sundial, pay 1, pass our turn. And what that does is it removes the Lightning Bolt or removal spell from the stack, and we just ignore it like it was never there. Now you may be wondering at this point, how are we actually going to get value out of these creatures having no Enter the Battlefield abilities? And for this, I'm going to move on to our creature package, and I think you'll really get the idea. So first in our creature package, we're running 4 copies of Hunted Horror. Hunted Horror is a 2-mana 7/7 with Trample. Hunted Horror also says, when it comes into play, put 2 3/3 green centaur creature tokens with protection from black under the control of target opponent. Now, this is an awful Enter the Battlefield ability, really ruining the value of this card. So when we have Torpor Orb on the battlefield or Sundial, we can remove that ability from this creature, so it's just a straight 2-mana 7/7 with Trample, allowing us to just completely dominate the game and get in a lot of damage really early. The next bad creature we're running is 4 copies of Treacherous Pit-Dweller. It's a 4/3 for only 2 mana as Undying, but its downside says when it enters the battlefield from a graveyard, target opponent gains control of it. But with Torpor Orb on the battlefield, it completely ignores that trigger and just gives it a 1/1 counter. Something we should keep in mind though is, as a downside, if we only have Sundial on the battlefield, we cannot stop our opponent from gaining control of it unless it dies on our turn. The next creature running is 4 copies of Avatar of Discord. It's a 3-mana 5/3 flyer, so we have a lot of good evasion from it. It's a good value creature, but what's that? It's got a bad downside that says that we have to sacrifice it unless we discard 2 cards. However, with Sundial out, we can pay 1, tap it to ignore it, or if we have just the Torpor Orb out, we just don't even have to worry about it. It's automatically ignored. And last but not least, keeping on theme with today's bad creatures, we're running 2 copies of Eater of Days. Eater of Days is a 4-mana 9/8 flying trample creature, and it has the worst Enter the Battlefield ability of all of our creatures so far, saying that when it comes into play, we skip our next 2 turns. Now, if you think about Modern, it's typically considered a 4-turn format, so if you've given up 2 of those 4 turns, you've guaranteed your loss. Thankfully, however, we have Torpor Orb and Sundial the Infinite, both allowing us to negate its Enter the Battlefield ability, so it's just a standard 4-mana 9/8 flying trampler. No big deal. Really helps us close out games really quick. Moving on to our spell package, we're running 4 copies of Duress, really cheap, efficient disruption. It'll allow us to keep our opponent off their game plan, and it allowed us to protect our combo pieces. Next up is 2 copies of Doomblade, really cheap, efficient spot removal to get rid of any big or small threats that are clogging up our opponent's board, allowing us to swing in. Next, we're running 4 copies of Victim of Night. Victim of Night is spot removal for pretty much everything in the Modern format. It's awesome because we have double black, so we don't have to worry about color fixing, so we're getting a lot of value. Next, we're running a combat trick and 2 copies of Sudden Spoiling. It protects us against go wide or aggro decks by acting as a fog. It allows our creatures to survive a big block, and it can allow us to destroy the centaur tokens our opponent might get on the off chance that our combo is disrupted. A lot of value in this card. And lastly, we're running 4 copies of Shred Memory. Shred Memory can be used as graveyard hate, or more often as a 3-mana tutor. Shred Memory allows us to grab any card with 2 CMC for its transmutability from our deck and place it in our hand. This grabs Sundial, it grabs Orb, it grabs Hunted Horror, it grabs Pit-Dweller, or any kind of removal. It's very flexible and it makes the deck a lot more consistent. And moving on to our lands. For this, we're running 4 copies of Ghost Quarter. Ghost Quarter is just a great main deck way to fight against Tron and man lands. Last but not least, we're running 18 Swamps, completely free, fulfilling all of our black mana needs. Moving on to the sideboard. For this, we're running 2 copies of Extirpate. Extirpate allows us to remove a card from an opponent's graveyard, possibly something that we either destroyed or we use Duress to get rid of, and we just remove it from the game along with all copies in their hand and all copies in their graveyard. It also cannot be responded to, so good luck countering that. Next, we're running 2 copies of Killing Wave. Killing Wave is just a really easy, efficient way to remove a lot of our opponent's board state, because we'll typically set it to like 3, and we'll only have about like 1 or 2 creatures on the battlefield at a time, so they have to pay 3 life per creature, and since we have so few creatures, we have no problem paying the 6 or whatever it is, and our opponent they can't pay that much for their creatures, and our creatures simply outvalue theirs. Next, we're running 2 copies of Nihil Spellbomb. It's a great way to get rid of graveyards, and it allows us to get some card advantage off of it by paying an extra black on activation. Next, we're running 2 copies of Ratchet Bomb. Ratchet Bomb's just a really good way to deal with tokens or go wide strategies from elves. We set it to 1, we crack the bomb, we destroy their board state. Or in other situations, it allows us to get rid of some things that black typically can't get rid of, such as artifacts, because our deck tends to scoop 2 Ensnaring Bridge. Next, we're running 2 copies of Wrenchmind. It's a great way to disrupt our opponent by making them discard 2 cards, or if we're going against a match that has Ensnaring Bridge, they really have to fight with themselves over whether or not to discard that bridge or discard probably a big chunk of their win condition, because we're just going to put them so far behind in card advantage. Next, we're running 1 copy of Hero's Downfall. It's a really nice instant speed way to get rid of a planeswalker or a creature that's giving us a lot of trouble. Next, we're running 2 copies of Infest. It's basically the black pyroclasm. It allows us to really hurt those go wide strategies or aggro decks at the cost of 3 mana. And lastly, we're running 2 copies of Memoricide. Memoricide's a card that allows us to search an opponent's library, graveyard, and hand for a card that we choose, and we get to exile those cards. So we can use it to get rid of our opponent's main combo pieces, or maybe one of their win cons, something that'll just slow them down and allow us to take over the game. Alright, let's look at some upgrades. First of all, we can replace our Duresses with Thoughtseize. Thoughtseize is just strictly better. At the cost of 2 life, we can remove any non-land card from their hand. As always, we can upgrade our mana base. For this, I'd like to recommend 4 copies of Marsh Flats, 4 copies of Bloodstained Mire, and 4 copies of Polluted Delta. This will allow us to fetch out our colors on turn 1. We're running black-white in the upgraded version because it allows us to deal with things that mono-black just has a harder time dealing with. Then I'd like to recommend that we run 4 Godless Shrines. Godless Shrine is just a shock land that allows us to get both colors of our mana fetched up on turn 1. And the upgraded sideboard consists of 2 copies of Surgical Extraction. It's the same thing pretty much as Extirpate, except you can pay Phyrexian mana for it, so just 2 life. You don't have to keep mana open for it. It's a little bit more flexible. 1 copy of Collective Brutality. It can act as a removal spell for a small creature, discard, and it can also act as some life gain. And then we're running 2 copies of Rest in Peace. Rest in Peace is just a great way to deal with any graveyard strategy decks. Then we're running 1 copy of Spellskite. It's just a great way to stop the opponent from targeting our creature with a lot of different removal, or we can redirect their pump spells on their creatures to us in matchups like Infest. Then we're running 2 copies of Stony Silence. Stony Silence stops Affinity. It hurts Tron because they can't activate their maps. It hurts Lantern Control. So it's got a lot of good matchups that it can go against and really help us have a lot more solid of a dominance in. Then we got 2 copies of Fulminator Mage. Fulminator Mage is mostly in here to combat Tron. Then we have a single copy of Anguished Unmaking. It'll help us get rid of any non-land permanent at the cost of 3 life. And then we're running 2 copies of Infest, great against go wide strategies. And then we're running 2 copies of Leyline of Sanctity because it'll allow us to fight against burn and disruption decks.
And that's the entire deck tech. If you enjoyed the video, consider sharing it, vote for the next video, pound the like button, and subscribe to Giant Monster Games. I'm Ted, and until next time, don't forget to game like a giant monster!